For more than 20 years, MetroCard vending machines in the New York City subway processed millions of fares on an operating system that IBM stopped supporting in 2006. The screens glowed blue. The magnetic stripes were red, the transactions cleared, and underneath it all, running the interface between the mainframe database and the simple electronics at every turnstile and bus fare box across the city, was OS/2. In 1987, IBM and Microsoft announced OS/2 at twin press conferences in New York and Miami as the future of personal computing, the system that would replace DOS on every desk in America. Bill Gates stood before the press and predicted that within 3 years, over 80% of new office systems would be built on OS/2. By 1995, OS/2 had sold 9 million copies. Windows had sold 60 million. The operating system that was supposed to be everywhere ended up underground, literally, inside ATMs, behind bank counters, beneath subway platforms, running the infrastructure that works so quietly nobody remembers what powers it. What killed OS/2 was never the technology. The company behind it spent hundreds of millions of dollars building an operating system that worked and could not figure out how to put it on a shelf. Two companies built the future together, tore it in half, and the half that survived was not the better half. You're watching Tech District, where we take apart the companies that built the electronic world, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. In this one, two partners built the same operating system, and the one that walked away won. If that is your kind of story, subscribe and hit like. By 1985, the personal computer was a fixture in American offices, but the software running it was already obsolete. DOS, the disk operating system that Microsoft had licensed to IBM in 1981, was a product of its era. It could run one program at a time. It had no graphical interface. Its memory limit was 640 kilobytes, and engineers at both IBM and Microsoft knew that this ceiling would eventually strangle every serious application written for the platform. You could not run a spreadsheet and a database simultaneously. You could not protect one program's memory from another. If a single application crashed, it took the entire machine with it. IBM, headquartered in Armonk, New York, was still the largest computer company on Earth, but its dominance was built on mainframes and mini-computers, machines that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and filled entire rooms. The IBM PC had been a runaway success since its launch in 1981, but IBM had made a decision that would haunt the company for the next decade. It had built the PC from off-the-shelf parts and published the technical specifications openly, which meant that any manufacturer in the world could build a compatible machine for less money. By the mid-1980s, Compaq and a growing field of clone makers were selling IBM-compatible PCs at prices IBM could not match. The hardware margins were collapsing. Microsoft, meanwhile, was still a relatively small software company in Redmond, Washington, with fewer than 2,000 employees. Its biggest source of revenue was the DOS licensing deal with IBM, and Bill Gates understood that DOS had a shelf life. The company that controlled the next operating system would control the personal computer industry for a generation. Gates intended to be the one who built it. Both companies needed the same thing, a modern operating system that could multitask, protect memory, and run a graphical interface, something powerful enough to replace DOS on the millions of PCs already sitting on desks across America. In August of 1985, IBM and Microsoft signed a joint development agreement to build it together. They called the project CP-DOS. The world would come to know it as OS/2. The agreement split the work between two teams separated by 3,000 miles. At IBM's Entry Systems division in Boca Raton, Florida, a software designer named Ed Iacobbucci took charge of the architecture. Iacobbucci had been born in Buenos Aires in 1953, emigrated to the United States as a child, and earned his engineering degree at Georgia Tech in 1975. He had joined IBM in 1979 and had already held design leadership responsibilities on IBM DOS. He was, by the accounts of the engineers who worked alongside him, the single person most responsible for the shape of OS/2 on IBM's side of the partnership. In Redmond, Microsoft assigned its own lead architect, a programmer named Gordon Letwin. Letwin was one of 11 employees in the famous 1978 Microsoft staff photograph taken in Albuquerque, and colleagues described him as thinking 3 or 4 years ahead of the state of the art. He would design and code HPFS, the high-performance file system, which supported long file names and metadata, at a time when DOS was still trapped in the 8.3 naming convention. In 1988, he published a book called Inside OS/2 through Microsoft Press, a work that laid out the case for OS/2 as the inevitable successor to DOS. On April 2, 1987, IBM announced OS/2 at simultaneous press conferences in New York and Miami. Gates told the assembled reporters that the majority of new business machines would be running OS/2 by the end of the decade. The ambition was total. OS/2 was not positioned as an upgrade. It was supposed to be a complete replacement for every copy of DOS on every personal computer in America. OS/2 1.0 shipped in December of 1987, ahead of its original 1988 schedule. It booted to a command line. It had no graphical interface. It required hardware that most consumers did not own. By November of 1989, fewer than 200,000 copies had been sold. The operating system that was supposed to replace DOS could barely give itself away, and the two companies building it were already pulling in opposite directions. The early versions of OS/2, numbered 1.0 through 1.3, demanded resources that most personal computers of the late 1980s simply did not have. A fast 386 processor, 6 megabytes of RAM at a time when most machines shipped with 1 or 2, 15 to 30 megabytes of hard disk space. For a home user in 1988, meeting those requirements meant spending hundreds of dollars on memory upgrades alone for an operating system that could not yet run most of the software they already owned. IBM tried to spin the numbers. By early 1991, the company claimed that 600,000 copies of OS/2 had shipped. Bill Gates went to the press and pointed out the arithmetic. 300,000 of those copies had been given away, free to large corporate accounts, to inflate the installed base. The actual sales figure was 300,000. IBM paid royalties on the difference to avoid the embarrassment of a formal dispute, and quietly continued using the higher number in its press materials. Behind the sales failure, the cost of building OS/2 was accelerating. By 1989, IBM was spending $150 million per year on OS/2 development, with $225 million in deferred development costs accumulating on the books. The software division's accounting was unusual even by IBM standards. It charged only a quarter of the annual development cost up front and deferred the remaining 3 quarters, which meant the true expense was partially hidden from the executives reviewing the budgets. That same year, Ed Iacobucci, the architect who had shaped OS/2 from its earliest design documents, left IBM. He moved across Boca Raton and co-founded Citrix Systems, a company built on the idea of remote computing and multi-user access, concepts he had pursued inside OS/2, but could not get IBM to commercialize at the speed he believed the market demanded. Citrix would eventually be valued in the billions. Iacobucci would never see the operating system he designed reach the market the way he had imagined it. He died of pancreatic cancer on June 21, 2013, at 59 years old, in the same Florida city where he had once drawn the blueprints for the future of personal computing. Then, on May 22, 1990, Microsoft shipped Windows 3.0, and everything changed. Windows 3.0 was not a new operating system. It was a graphical shell running on top of DOS, held together with enough memory management tricks to feel modern on cheap hardware. It cost $149 for a full license and $50 for an upgrade. It sold 2 million copies in its first 6 months. By the time Windows 3.1 arrived 2 years later, the total had reached 10 million, and Microsoft's fiscal year revenue had jumped from $803 million to $1.18 billion. The partnership between IBM and Microsoft, already strained by disagreements over code quality and product direction, collapsed under the weight of those sales figures. IBM wanted OS/2 to be a proprietary system closely tied to its own hardware. Microsoft wanted it to run on every clone on Earth. IBM resented what it saw as undisciplined code from the Microsoft side. Microsoft watched Windows 3.0 outsell OS/2 by an order of magnitude and quietly began reassigning its best engineers away from the joint project. By 1990, the joint development agreement was effectively dead. IBM assumed full responsibility for OS/2 going forward. Microsoft walked away, took the lessons it had learned building OS/2's protected mode architecture, and hired Dave Cutler, the architect behind Digital Equipment Corporation's VAX/VMS operating system, to lead something new. That project would become Windows NT, but the divorce came with a clause that would bleed IBM for years. Because large portions of OS/2's existing code had been written by Microsoft engineers, the licensing terms required IBM to pay Microsoft a royalty of $20 for every copy of OS/2 it sold. The company that had left the partnership still collected a check every time IBM managed to sell the product it had abandoned. On OS/2 2.0 alone, with sales of 2.5 million copies, that royalty amounted to at least $50 million, paid from IBM to Microsoft, for the privilege of selling IBM's own operating system. Gordon Letwin, the Microsoft architect who had designed HPFS and written the book on OS/2, left Microsoft in 1993. He co-founded the Wilberforce Foundation with his wife, Rose, to fund environmental conservation. The man who built the file system that would one day run silently inside New York's transit infrastructure walked away from the technology industry entirely and never came back. IBM now owned OS/2 alone, and it was about to build the best version of it that would ever exist at exactly the worst possible moment. The forces that undermined OS/2 were not technical. They were structural, and they were already in motion before the first line of OS/2 2.0 code was compiled. The clone market had remade the personal computer industry in Microsoft's image. IBM's share of the PC market dropped from 80% in 1982 to 20% by 1992. Compaq, Dell, and Gateway were selling machines at margins IBM could not touch, and every one of those machines shipped with Windows pre-installed. Microsoft's OEM licensing model made this almost inevitable. Hardware manufacturers paid a per-machine fee to Microsoft, regardless of which operating system the customer actually wanted. The price of Windows was baked into the cost of the computer itself. OS/2 was an additional purchase on a separate shelf, at a higher price, for a product the salesperson at the electronics store had never used and could not demonstrate. Inside IBM, the war was even worse. The company's PC division and its software division treated each other not as partners, but as rivals. IBM's own PC company refused to preload OS/2 on its consumer machines. Customers who wanted OS/2 on a new IBM computer had to specifically request it, and even then, the installation was often poorly executed. On some models, IBM shipped both OS/2 and Windows side by side on the same hard drive, making no effort to default to its own product. The financial toll was enormous. IBM posted losses of $2.86 billion in 1991 and $4.97 billion in 1992. The stock price, which had traded above $170 per share in 1987, cratered to $10 in 1993. The company that had defined American computing for decades was losing more money in a single year than most of its competitors earned in 5. Lou Gerstner arrived as CEO in 1993, the first outsider ever hired to lead IBM, and began cutting. 35,000 employees were laid off in the restructuring that followed. Projects were frozen, budgets were slashed. In the middle of all this, surrounded by collapsing revenue and divisions that refused to cooperate, the OS2 team in Austin, Texas, somehow shipped the most technically accomplished personal computer operating system of the early 1990s. OS2 2.0 arrived in April of 1992, 5 years after the original announcement, and 2 years after the divorce from Microsoft. It was the first 32-bit consumer operating system IBM had ever released. It could run DOS programs and Windows 3.x programs simultaneously, each inside its own protected virtual machine, so that a crash in one application could not bring down the rest of the system. Windows 3.1, which shipped the same month, could not do this. Windows 3.1 ran every program in the same memory space. And when one failed, they all failed. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between an apartment building with fire doors and one without them. OS2 2.0 introduced the workplace shell, an object-oriented graphical desktop that treated every file, folder, and device as a persistent object with properties that could be inspected, modified, and linked. You could drag a printer onto a document, and it would print. You could drag a document onto a shredder icon, and it would delete. You could create shadow objects, live references to files stored anywhere on the system, years before Windows offered anything comparable. The design philosophy behind the workplace shell was not decoration. It was architecture. In concept, it was closer to what Apple would eventually ship with Mac OS X nearly a decade later than to anything Microsoft offered in 1992. Underneath the interface, Gordon Letwin's HPFS file system supported file names up to 254 characters, extended attributes, and faster access on large disk volumes, at a time when Windows users were still naming their files in 8 characters, a dot, and a 3-letter extension. OS2 2.0 retailed at $195 against $150 for Windows 3.1. It sold 2.5 million copies. Windows 3.1 sold 30 million. 2 years later, in October of 1994, IBM shipped OS2 Warp internally version 3.0, and this was the version that came closest to breaking through. The engineering team in Austin had stripped the memory requirements down to 4 megabytes, half of what OS2 2.0 had demanded. OS2 Warp shipped with the bonus pack, a bundle of productivity applications that included a word processor, a spreadsheet, a database, and a personal information manager, all in the box, at a retail price of $89.95. In 1995, OS2 Warp won InfoWorld's Product of the Year. It took 5 awards at CeBIT. Chip magazine named it Operating System of the Year. DOS International did the same. 4 separate publications looked at every operating system available that year and concluded that OS2 Warp was the best one. The users who found OS2 loved it, not with casual preference, but with the conviction of people who had tested both options and made their choice. In February 1992, an IBM employee named Dave Whittle founded Team OS2, a grassroots advocacy group that began as an internal discussion forum on IBM's worldwide network and grew into an international volunteer force of over 10,000 members across nearly 20 countries. They operated on CompuServe, Prodigy, America Online, FidoNet, and Usenet. They traveled to trade shows in salmon-colored shirts, installed OS2 on display computers that were running Windows, and handed out demo discs to anyone who would take one. At Comdex in Las Vegas in 1993, they staged what they called the Teamer Invasion, flooding the show floor with volunteers who outnumbered IBM's own paid marketing staff. IBM's official marketing department could not figure out how to sell OS2 to consumers. 10,000 unpaid volunteers figured it out without them, but the company behind the product was already dismantling its own position. In 1992, before OS2 2.0 even reached store shelves, IBM disbanded its desktop software division, the internal team that had been building a word processor presentation software, and desktop publishing tools exclusively for OS/2. Those applications could have given OS/2 the same kind of exclusive software advantage that kept buyers loyal to the Macintosh. Instead, IBM killed them. Then it spent millions paying developers who made DOS and Windows software to port their existing applications to OS/2. Those developers, by most accounts, took IBM's money and delivered the minimum viable effort. The ported software ran, but it ran slowly, and it ran like an afterthought, because that is exactly what it was. Every copy of OS/2 that included Windows compatibility, which was every copy anyone actually wanted to buy, sent $20 back to Microsoft in royalties. IBM was funding its competitor with every sale, and it had just eliminated the one internal team that could have built the native software that made Windows compatibility unnecessary. Rick Siegel, a Microsoft evangelist, would later acknowledge that OS/2 had been superior in every way, and that Microsoft's priority had been to make sure OS/2 never got a foothold. Microsoft did not have to work very hard at that. IBM was doing most of the work on its own. The engineers in Austin had built something remarkable. The executives had taken the marketing budget and pointed it at a college football bowl game that nobody in the technology industry could explain. What happened next would cost IBM the desktop forever. In December of 1992, IBM announced a 3-year title sponsorship for the Fiesta Bowl, the college football game played every January in Tempe, Arizona. The cost, according to the International Events Group, was $4.5 million. The game was officially renamed the IBM OS/2 Fiesta Bowl. Journalist Tony Kornheiser captured the disconnect perfectly. I have absolutely no idea what an OS/2 is. Internally, IBM employees had their own name for it. They called it the Fiasco Bowl. The sponsorship bought advertising time during an NBC broadcast watched by millions of football fans, and IBM used that airtime to show screen recordings of 32-bit Lotus Smart Suite running on OS/2. There was no demographic evidence that college football viewers had any interest in preemptive multitasking. IBM had paid millions for the right to speak to an audience that did not know what it was selling and had no reason to find out. The marketing disasters compounded from there. When IBM chose the name Warp for OS/2 3.0, the company wanted Patrick Stewart, the actor who played Captain Picard on television's Star Trek, to serve as master of ceremonies at the launch. Paramount Pictures sent a cease and desist letter blocking any association with the Star Trek trademark. IBM scrambled to redefine warp using its dictionary meaning: bent, twisted, distorted. Kate Mulgrew, who had just been cast as the captain on the newest Star Trek series, replaced Stewart at the event. The advertising agency Lintas was fired in May of 1994, and Ogilvy and Mather was brought in with barely a month before the October launch to build a campaign from scratch. What emerged used psychedelic imagery and a tagline that read, "A totally cool way to run your computer." Language that sounded like it had been written by someone who had never met a computer user. Meanwhile, across the country in Redmond, Microsoft was preparing the launch of Windows 95 as something the technology industry had never seen before. And 1 week before Fall Comdex in 1995, IBM's marketing director eliminated the entire Grassroots marketing department in Austin, the small team that had supported Dave Whittle's Team OS/2 and its 10,000 volunteers to meet a corporate headcount reduction target. Whittle left IBM. The coordinators who had kept the volunteer network running were reassigned. The people who had been selling OS/2 for free, out of loyalty and conviction, were abandoned by the company they had spent 3 years trying to save. You can read IBM's marketing failure 2 ways. The executives did not understand consumers, or the corporation had grown so large that its own divisions were working against each other without realizing it. Honest history holds both readings at once. But on August 24, 1995, the reading no longer mattered. Microsoft launched Windows 95 as a cultural event unlike anything the software industry had produced. The company spent $12 million just to license the Rolling Stones' Start Me Up for the advertising campaign. There were midnight store openings across America. Jay Leno hosted a launch event for 2,500 guests at Microsoft's campus in Redmond. Microsoft purchased an entire print run of the Times of London for the British launch. 7 million copies of Windows 95 sold in the first 7 weeks. 4 days before the launch, Lou Gerstner stood before reporters and conceded publicly that IBM had lost its opportunity to go after the desktop. He called the fight over OS/2 the last war. The sentence landed like a verdict. Microsoft had already made the loss personal. In the weeks before August 24th, Microsoft withheld the Windows 95 Golden Master Code from IBM, the final release version that PC manufacturers needed to pre-install the operating system on new machines. Every other major manufacturer received the code on July 17th. IBM received its copy 15 minutes before Microsoft's official launch event. More than 5 weeks later, the delay cost IBM the entire back-to-school selling season. And by the company's own internal estimates, between 7 and 10 major corporate accounts worth roughly $180 million in lost revenue. Days after the launch, David Barnes, the IBM evangelist who had spent years traveling 41 countries to promote OS/2, told a New York Times reporter the words that the OS/2 community would never forget. OS/2 is a great operating system, Barnes said. Sony's Betamax was a better system than VHS. Then he added that he planned to install Windows 95 on the computers in his own house. IBM responded with weeks of silence. By the end of 1996, OS/2 held 3.3% of the desktop market. Revenue from OS/2 that year was roughly $550 million, sustained mostly by server licenses and the banking installations that had no reason to switch. The consumer market was gone. Over the course of the decade, IBM had poured well over $1 billion into OS/2 development. Workplace OS for PowerPC, developer funding that produced almost nothing, and advertising campaigns that sold even less. The market had chosen the operating system that crashed more often, multitasked less reliably, and came pre-installed on every beige box at the store. IBM stopped selling OS/2 on December 23, 2005. It ended all support on December 31, 2006. The engineers who had built OS/2 in Austin scattered across the industry. The independent developers who had staked their small companies on the platform watched IBM walk away without a backward glance. Brad Wardle, who had founded Stardock and built Galactic Civilizations, the first major commercial OS/2 game, estimated that by 1999, the number of active OS/2 end users had fallen below 5,000. IBM, at its most optimistic, had once claimed 13 million. The operating system was declared finished. It did not stop working. Beneath the streets of New York, the MetroCard vending machines kept processing fares on OS/2 for more than 2 decades after IBM withdrew support. Banco do Brasil ran 10,000 machines on OS/2 Warp at its peak in the 1990s, migrating to Linux only in 2006. Bank Satarat Iran operated over 35,000 OS/2 workstations into the 2010s. The London Underground's Jubilee Line extension ran its signals on OS/2 from 1999 until 2011. Safeway supermarket checkouts processed groceries on it. Stop and Shop registers rang up sales on it. The machines did not know the operating system was dead. They just kept running. The community survived too. The Warpstock conferences, organized not by IBM but by users, have been held annually in the United States and Europe. In 2017, a company called Arca Noae released Arca OS, a licensed descendant of OS/2 updated to run on modern UEFI hardware, and it received another update in 2026. People are still writing software for an operating system that IBM abandoned 20 years ago, and they are doing it because the software still works. Ed Yacobuchi's legacy outlived OS/2 in ways he could not have predicted when he left IBM in 1989. Citrix Systems, the company he built across town in Boca Raton, grew into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise built on the same remote computing concepts he had first pursued inside OS/2's architecture. Gordon Letwin's HPFS influenced NTFS, the file system that runs on every copy of Windows manufactured today. The file system that Microsoft's own architect designed for OS/2 became the ancestor of the one that replaced it. The operating system died. Its engineering did not. Think about that MetroCard machine one more time. A vending machine in a subway station, processing fares underground. Built on an operating system that Bill Gates once predicted would sit on 80% of the desks in America. It never reached those desks. It reached the places where failure was not an option, where uptime mattered more than marketing, where the question was not which operating system looked best on a store shelf, but which one would still be working a decade later without anyone touching it. The answer, for banks and transit authorities and supermarket chains across the world, was OS/2. IBM did not lose OS/2 to Microsoft. IBM lost OS/2 to IBM. It disbanded the software division that could have made Windows compatibility irrelevant. It refused to preload its own operating system on its own computers. It paid its competitor $20 for every copy sold. It fired the volunteers. It sponsored a football game, and when the CEO finally stood before the press and called it the last war, the engineers in Austin already knew. They had known for years. They had built the better product, and they had watched their own company choose not to sell it. If you ran OS/2, if you worked on it, if you managed a system that still runs it behind a bank counter or underneath a city, drop a comment below. Tell us the version, the year, and whether it is still running. The people who use these machines know more about what was lost than the people who canceled them. Subscribe to Tech District and join the archive. We have the story of another American tech empire coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.